it was so funny to be part of that, to watch that wholesome direct. And there's like 10 games that are about knitting sweaters for your cat or something, and then we come in and it's like, you hear Meghna's voice going, "The river is a god," and they killed her. And people in the chat were like, "What is this, Elden Ring?"
Hey! Hi, Meghna. Hi, Joost. I'm very happy to have you with me today on this little interview because you work on a project that's, I think, really, really interesting and really innovative in the field that is dear to our hearts, which is trying to make video games that talk about the real world and real world issues. But before you tell us more about it, the game called All Will Rise, maybe let's introduce yourself. Meghna?
Hi, I'm Meghna Jayanth, and I'm a narrative designer. I've been working in the industry for over 10 years now, mostly in indie games. And I'm really interested in how mainstream games kind of participate in fantasies of colonialism and capitalism, and whether it's possible to design ways outside of it, while also making commercial games. So it's like an interesting needle to thread. Yeah, but I started off in the industry making a game called 80 Days, back in the days where there's still a question about whether mobile games were a thing. And I think maybe they're a thing, and I don't know, maybe they're not anymore, really. But it was an anti-colonial retelling of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. And then I've made I think All Will Rise, which is a game about taking billionaires to court for their climate crimes, is probably like the final form evolution. It kind of makes sense.
Hi everyone, so I'm Joost Vervoort. I'm Impact Director for All Will Rise, and I'm an Associate Professor at Utrecht University at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development here in the Netherlands. And I got started, so my work in general has been a lot about scenarios of the future, and I've worked with policymakers and governments all around the world for a long time, doing sort of future exploration work. And 4 years ago, 4.5 years ago already, I got involved with Fossilvrij, an activist group who were organizing a court case against one of the world's biggest pension funds, ABP, which is the Dutch civil servant pension fund, who had 15 billion euros invested in fossil fuels at that moment. And they were organizing a court case to take them to court for not following the Paris Agreement and for refusing to divest from fossil fuels. And I thought, what can we do with games, And I thought the connection that I made more or less immediately was Ace Attorney, but about climate court cases, something like that. And I mentioned that in the meeting, and there was a teenager there who was like, "That sounds amazing!" Immediately jumped up, and I was like, "Okay." So I wrote a blog about this. A lot of our thinking really aligns as a team around how do you make something, because lots of people making games that are more sort of meant to be serious games or educational games. That's something that we really want to stay away from, because I feel like they're just not very impactful. They don't really do anything. I think a game needs to be amazing and truly something that people feel inspired by and attracted to and fall in love with, and it really touches something in people first, And I think that commercial games do that really well, right? Game developers are masters at this, but there's a huge gap between the sort of like people trying to do something with games in the space of education or awareness raising or something, and then on the other hand, people making beautiful games, but they don't always say anything of substance,
There's actually some nuance that maybe I would like to bring to the discussion, which is, it happens that some films, some movies are presented as documentaries that are designed to make you change your mind, and it's presented like that. It's sold like that. It's not sold as a enticing story or something that will make you think, but as a second thought, it's designed as something impactful. And those who are designed like that, but who work, they have a super high level of authenticity, and you can connect to the person who is carrying the message and who is trying to show you something that maybe you don't want to see, or maybe you know but don't really want to fully acknowledge. And I think that in the serious games field, more often than not, those games feel manipulative because they are designed to change your mind without you knowing. Whereas I think that going full frontal and saying, no, this is going to change your mind, but I will tell you why, and this is going to be my point of view, and it's going to be a little bit confrontational. Maybe that would be a more interesting way to tackle those applied video games. Sometimes I feel like they like honesty a little bit.
I think the way that I've sort of talked about this before is that you want games to express something, not try to explain or manipulate, right? It has to feel like indeed like it's coming from you. You want to engage with media that feel like the person or persons who made it really cared about something. There has to be a sense of care and expression and there. So I completely agree, right?
Yeah, but I also think there's something also around, particularly I think when like a fundamental misunderstanding about the craft that is also kind of going on, right? Like, because to me the theme of the game is its mechanics, and it is how agency is designed, and we are kind of in the business of designing, not just designing agency pleasurably necessarily, but in very specific ways to create specific sort of feelings and ideas. Which is why I think in the serious space, I think the most successful games are often satirical. I'm thinking of like Oligarchy, or things like that, which again, to your point, Florent, are very, very, very direct. They're not pretending to be otherwise. And they're using the mechanics of like extraction and accumulation and all of these things to kind of sort of upend them for you and make you feel differently about them. Very usefully, we moved into this kind of conversational card gameplay. From my side, I think it's super interesting in narrative design terms, because it allows us to talk about sort of changing people's minds and emotions rather than talking purely about facts, which I think is a very like silly way to really approach. Why do people believe the things that they believe? Why do people do things that they know are bad? Why do people work for Shell? It isn't because they don't know that Shell is a polluter. It is because there are sociological constructs, there's psychological constructs, there's all kinds of other reasons why we have these beliefs, and we're much more interested in being playful about kind of teasing some of those out, which I think is much better done through the context of play, because I think that ludic container makes it a very like sort of safe space to retry types of conversations that are difficult to have in the real world, rather than just be making choices in a much more kind of directed fashion.
When we started thinking about All Will Rise, we had this more of a model of maybe solving a detective story, right? And sort of like putting the pieces together, and that's the way you get to the solution, which is partly what's going on and partly still what's going on. It's still a little bit like that, I would say. You're still solving a mystery, but a lot of this work is a lot more about how do you frame it, how do you choose, what's your strategy, how do you bring certain issues to the table, and that makes it much more exciting for players to really think about how can I approach this thing, right? If it's just a puzzle that you sort of put together, that sense of strategic agency that we want to also cultivate goes missing. And I think with All Will Rise, we're not trying to make a game that tells people that those who destroy the environment are bad or something. People either know or they don't care, right? We're making a game that invites people to get involved with social action because it's chaotic, because it's fun, it's absurd, it's tragic, it's dangerous, it's connecting, and it's community building, right? That sort of just so I've played All Will Rise, our demo, with a bunch of high school students over the last year, and we use it to have conversations about what it means to be involved in society. And you hear a lot of these kids saying that they care about the future, but they just feel like nothing can be done, and that all politicians are terrible and everything is terrible. And of course, lots of politicians are terrible, but that nothing can be done. And then based on playing All Will Rise, we have a conversation about, okay, it might not be easy to do things, but there's a lot that's possible. When I started, it was 4 women organizing, this massive campaign, and with all their volunteers, and really, because I have to say, the ABP pension fund, due to pressure by Fossilvrij and the announcement of the court case, actually ended up divesting 18 billion euros from fossil into renewables, right? And that's sort of like, there was a moment there that was glorious and exciting, and really, people really did not expect things to, people expected to have to work on the case for years. And I was there in the Zoom meeting when we all sort of discovered that they had actually sort of like agreed to divest. And those sort of moments of unexpected glory and joy and struggle and so on are really, really part of the game. And I think with the card mechanics, you really have that sense of discovery and strategy and agency. Then the other thing that we really thought about is we really don't want this to be a game that is only interesting to people who are climate activists or something like this. This should be a game that speaks to much broader concerns, right? And the broader concerns are a few powerful assholes are wrecking our future. Something that speaks to many people, right? There are, of course, people who would defend them to the death, simping for Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and whatever. But this is, it's a struggle. It's a class struggle. And it's a struggle against the billionaire class, and we feel like that's much more salient and much more eternal, right? That's always.
Yeah.
I think people absolutely do, right? I mean, even if we like switch tracks to climate change, which is sort of the perception is that people don't care about it, but like the numbers don't lie. If you ask people, do we want climate action? It's like in the 90s that people do.
Yes.
Do we feel like our governments are not doing enough? So actually we are literally a silent majority, but there's an entire machinery arrayed against us, right? Which I also feel like is important for us to talk about in leftist spaces, almost berating people for not being interested. Whereas actually I think, we are living in especially in the kind of imperial core in the West, we're kind of living in a like mall casino with like Rupert Murdoch blasting sort of content into your eyes 24/7 and AI slop everywhere, and while people are like increasingly like exhausted and trying to make ends meet and are really worked to the point of precarity and exhaustion where they don't have the energy, and that's how the billionaire class like it,
Yes.
I'm almost more amazed that like we get to make this kind of work and kind of have an audience for it, or people willing to fund it, right? Especially when also so much of funding ultimately does stem from the rich and billionaires. I mean, one of my previous games, the SD Studios, is funded by Annapurna, which is run by the Ellisons, Megan Ellison and Larry Ellison of sort of Oracle. And there's a kind of uncomfortable reality to how much we are all living in their world.
And also, I agree that people actually do care, but what I absolutely loved about All Will Rise demo is that it is possible to care enough to do something and so that it's fun. Because one of the very first contact you have with the three attorneys in the game is because they plan on getting drunk together, which I think it's just a good way to present it, is that activism and actually doing something with other people who share your concerns is a super good way to socialize also, to make friends and to have good times and to be angry together at the same thing, which of course, as we all know, especially in France, creates bonds. and so I thought it was really great for you to just decide that, I don't know if it will remain the same in the final complete game, but I thought it was very smart to present the three main characters are people who are A, exhausted, B, knowing that they are fighting a much bigger evil than what they can deal with, but also C, are very enthusiastic doing so. I think it was just a great approach.
I think that is the thing that I think to me what baffles me is how did climate activism or activism in general get a rap of being like boring and worthy when actually like it's genuinely, I think, one of the most exciting, inspiring, challenging, complicated, at times really irritating, at times really, but it's so full of life. And I think that idea of like being in the world is so worthwhile, and it's way more worthwhile than being nihilistic or cynical or disconnected. Sink into one of these many screens, and I realize, and I think there's something very lovely for me when I think about it, that we're turning this screen like actually into a portal into another world. And I think one of the things we also really are thinking about as we make this game is, is there a way that we just kind of don't fully offer catharsis within the world of the game and leave that little bit of energy left over for people to go back out into the real world, And I don't know whether we'll succeed, but it's certainly something we're thinking about a lot.
We can't extract ourselves from the system we are in. And I have a lot to say about the system of video games, the video games industry in general. And quite a big part of what I have to say is not positive, I'm afraid, because I guess that it's clearly one of the things that I use to keep people busy and make people forget about how tough they have it in their everyday lives. And I completely understand the need for some kind of solace, some kind of way to blow some steam after a hard day's work. But also sometimes I fear in participating in that field, we are also participating in the things remaining the way they are, and it's a concern to me sometimes. I don't know if I'm just overthinking it or if it's something you feel too.
You plucked all the thoughts straight out of my brain.
Yeah, I think it's a really real concern. I mean, there's even research that shows that if people participate in a virtual activity around solving a serious issue, that may make them feel like they've actually done something already, right? So that they don't have to do it anymore. And I think that's an interesting question. They've gone through some kind of serious gaming experience, and then they're like, okay, I did a good thing today.
That's also a part of the next question I wanted to ask you both about living with your incoherences, and because the reason I started working on Ithaca, a game about a topic that I think should be the topic we as a species keep discussing over and over again, because it's the first time there's an actual threat for the very existence of human life on Earth. I thought to myself, I need to do something about it, because we had this lunch with my wife and we were discussing family matters and our relationship to our daughters, and also, of course, environmental peril and climate change. And we bumped into this very uncomfortable question, which is, how will we explain in a few years or decades that we had all the science and all the knowledge needed to understand the size of the matter and the scope of the problem, and yet we went on with our normal lives and not stop. We didn't decide to stop everything we were doing to just dive into fighting for a change. And sometimes I feel good about that, but also sometimes I think this is still way far from what should be needed. We should all be doing what the three main characters in All Will Rise do, which is devote all our energy and our life's work to changing things. Yet we don't do that. We make games instead, and sometimes it feels a little bit not silly. Maybe silly is not the right word, but too light. So yeah, I still find it complicated to reconcile the reality of the magnitude of the issue we're facing and the little piece that we're trying to bring to the conversation, if that makes sense.
Maybe to give you some encouragement, I come from a space of working on policy, right? And I've moved into games and culture for a reason. And I think I sometimes feel this as well. It can be very indirect and so on. But I truly believe that if you think about, like, if I look at the far right and what they do well in terms of their strategies, is that they are really working hard now for decades, I would say, also including issues in games and so on, to dominate the culture, right? To have those types of politics dominate the culture. And if we can make 1,000 games like Ithaca, All Will Rise, and so on, it suffuses the culture with certain ideas about what the world could be and what's worth fighting for and so on, that are now currently being dominated by other ideas, right? And I submitted a paper this week about games as imagination infrastructure, resubmitted, long story, but and I actually quoted Andrew Breitbart in this paper, because Breitbart, though being a Tea Party reactionary, and then of course his platform was turned into even more monstrous stuff by Steve Bannon, said politics is downstream from culture. And I think that's
I think we've been away from the battlefield of culture wars for too long, and it's even more a shame, as I think the ideas we fight for are very desirable and can have lots of people behind them. But we need to just put them forward instead of reacting. I don't know how it is in your countries, but in France, the left for the last 30 years has spent most of its time reacting to the talking points by the right and by the far right. Like, what can we say about immigration? What can we say about security? What can we say about this and that? And the debt, the question of the debt, we need to have good answers, because else it will feel like we are not serious enough to be in charge. Whereas they almost never put forward what they actually want for us as a society and what they think is something that is of value and we should fight for, which I think it's a shame. It's a huge missed opportunity.
Like, I think there is also a kind of need for joyfulness on our side, that the vision for the future is actually a good one. And yes, you might give up these things, but you gain these other things. And I also think if we see ourselves in some ways as, I mean, I think of myself as a propagandist for the revolution or for the cause or for these ideas, right? And I think one of the ways in which you are convincing is also living your life well and enjoying it. And I don't really feel like any value in participating in what I see as a very like almost Christian idea of like suffering and penitence and abasement as part of moral goodness and purity. And I think if we don't offer people like actually fighting for all of the great things in life is also like, it's juicy and it's joyful and it's messy and yes, it might be contradictory, but it doesn't require you to wear a hair shirt not enjoy anything about your own life because some people are suffering over that. Like, of course, we all want a bit more empathy, but like, yeah. So I also think that I genuinely enjoy making games. I think it feels meaningful to me. It feels joyful. Creative expression is meaningful. And I think if we lose that, then what the hell are we fighting for in a way, right?
One thing that we've noticed with All Will Rise is how we get to sort of like crash the reality between games and everyday reality. So we're drawing the game's sort of like content on real people's experiences. That's really interesting. We had our boycott of Microsoft that really caused a stir, and it's a little bit of a connection between our own activism and our own work as game developers and how that relates to what we would imagine the people in our game would be doing. And I recently had a really interesting experience. I was at the board, I had a meeting with the activist group Vosso Vrij that inspired the game, with the board the chairman of the board of the ABP pension fund, who they're putting more pressure on because they're now they're working with BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, and BlackRock is reneging on all kinds of climate agreements and so on. And so they're putting the pressure on them. And so I was in a room with a bunch of these Vosso Vrij people and volunteers. The chairman of the board of ABP was there with his communications advisor, his marketing advisor, and his, strategist, all looking at him to say the right things. And it was like being in an All Will Rise card battle, And I feel... And because I literally saw the cards flying around, we all got like one question to ask, so we could so we had one card, the chairman played the prove it card, essentially, like give us more evidence and stuff like that. And I think that is part of what is exciting to me, is thinking about, you are going on this trip, right? You're taking a trip, a road trip. I think part of the answer is going to be breaking down the boundaries between play and life in that way.
And I also just want to add, one of the really interesting things that I have really noticed and like really internalized is when we talk to like the serious people doing serious work and important work in the world, like the activists, the lawyers, the policymakers, all of them are so excited to talk to game developers, which I find wild. I'm like, you're out here like fighting these gigantic battles and doing the coolest stuff, and they're like, no, what you do is cool. And I think we kind of have to maybe like acknowledge that, right? Like, and ultimately, whenever I feel a little bit depressed and existential about making games, I'm like, yeah, but goddamn, I could be an investment banker. Like, what do we need, what do we need more of in the world? And what is truly wasteful here, ultimately? Like, I would love a world, actually, in which more people got to, like, design games than worked in a financial institution or at BlackRock,
So I feel like we have to almost train people, and I'm very excited about doing this in high schools, for instance, game literacy, going to high schools and having classes there, just like you have literacy classes and where you read literature or whatever, to just teach people how they can think about the real world in terms of the games they've played and vice versa, to break down that barrier.
Like with the loss of the arcade, we've just lost that collective physical space for games. And I'm always like, I'm kind of obsessed with the idea of like a games book club, or like just like how can we get people to start thinking about and playing games socially and collectively, and to treat it more like a social, cultural kind of artifact, which I think is so important.
That's one of the biggest issues I have with my games not being profitable. Because if I were rich, I would rent a shop in the street in Cluny. Cluny is the town next to where the little village where I live. And I would have a pad port, so I don't know how to say that in English, but an open door to the street. Yeah. And we would design and develop games, and also have a little corner with a bar with coaches and maybe game consoles or PCs, and have those game clubs just so people can come in, see how we work, see how we make the games, and then play maybe an evening once a month. We play the same game that we decided we would play, and then we discuss it. I think we need to have way more culture around video games than we actually are.
So we're aiming at a early 2027 release at the latest. It might be sooner, but we don't want to.
At the latest? Oh, okay. So you're well advanced.
Yeah. No, we are. We are.
Meghna is sweating profusely right now.
We are. As far as I understand from our producer.
Yes.
We are. That is a conservative estimate. So.
No, I think it's, and I think it's true. And I think we're really excited to kind of get it out and get it in people's hands. And, and we always imagined maybe using the same mechanics and structures to tell other smaller stories set in different places. And I'm excited for that. What you're doing is really like the dream, right? To be able to sustain a studio and then work on multiple things, and build on that knowledge base, which is so difficult to do. And I really do, like, I look around and I see who are the people in the indie space, in the interesting indie space, doing great work. It's generally people who have managed to, like, work on the second game and the third game and the fourth game together. So
it was absolutely, it was great, very interesting. I hope people who watch this will find it interesting too, because we need more people in that space. So come join us.
I think your whole project is a breath of fresh air, and I think it's really amazing that you're making that journey. It's super cool. I'm really looking forward to following it.
Worst case scenario, the Kickstarter is a complete failure. But I went to Ithaca by car, so it's just like a great thing to do once in a lifetime. So it's going to be good anyway. Thanks again for coming here and for the chat. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.